Hi everyone and welcome. We're out here in my wormery and I've got a couple bins down here on the floor. They're the ones that you see that have coverings over the tops. All the rest of the bins you see up here on the shelf have pretty much no coverings on them. But those two bins down there, being my newest bins, are still covered. And in the case of those two bins, the one on the left, that one's 42 days of age at this point. It's been a week since it was last fed. And this one over here is not even a week old yet. It's 6 days of age. And I'm going to throw some food in there too. So I'm going to get these two bins fed with some old cabbage I found in the refrigerator. And we're going to get a chance to see how they're coming along. It's my estimate that this bin over here has approximately 5,000 worms in it. And this bin so far has about 2,000 in it. So why don't we get them up onto the bench and give them some food. Now the newer of the two bins, the 6-day-old bin, hasn't been fed yet. The only thing that's happened here so far was the introduction of worms that had been moved out of other bins. And that's what you're seeing here, is that the original dry leaves you see around the edge were the top covering for the original launch of worms. And later came this pile here in the middle, which brought over not only worms, but a fair bit of castings that the worms were occupying when they were extracted from their old home. So to give us a little bit of room to place the new food into, and I've got quite a bit to put in here, I'm going to just open up a little hole down the middle here, kind of a crevice, to give us room to place in the fresh feeding, as well as a little bit of bedding too, as a base to go under the food. It'll also give us a chance to see how things are progressing down here within the bin. I mean, this being a fairly new bin, it's not surprising that there's a good amount of fresh bedding down underneath the feeding zone. But nevertheless, even though there's already a good amount of bedding down here, I'm going to start by placing a little bit of shredded paper. Place it underneath here. Because I went through the mess on my desk and I took all the stuff that seemed like it was just old obsolete paperwork and shredded it. And now I'm just trying to compost it. So I've got a fair bit of paper here that I'd like to do away with. So this should do as a nice carbon source for the worms beneath the food they're going to get. And here is the cabbage that they're getting. And like I mentioned earlier, this stuff was starting to look pretty nasty. Yeah, definitely looking pretty nasty. So it went bad. It was placed into the freezer for safekeeping so it doesn't get all nasty and stinky on me. And it seemed like it was time to move it along to its final destination, which is into the mouths of our little wormies here. Okay, so besides that initial handful of fairly larger chunks, I just reached down into the bottom of the bag to try to pull out some smaller, tinier pieces. And that seems like a pretty nice feeding for them. Seemed like I could have grabbed a little bit more on that last handful, so I'm going to give them even more. Just a little bit more to make it 2 complete handfuls in my rough estimation as to how much we just placed in there. So the stuff I'm sprinkling on now, it's not salt, not seasoning. It's the grit that I use in my worm bins. It's just a coarse substance. In this case, it's crushed eggshells that worms need to digest their food. And before we start scraping back some of this material in the bin, I've got this box here with some dry leaves in it, which I'm going to use to cover up with as well. So that's a nice abundant amount of bedding material spread below and over the top of the feeding, which should make them pretty happy and give them a pretty nice balance of not only nitrogen-rich food items, but also a good carbon source to go hand in hand with that. So since I have not yet been in here, this is going to give me a little opportunity to just scope around, check out how things are doing throughout the bin. Like I said, we've only recently launched this bin with what I estimate to be a couple thousand worms. But as I gradually start depopulating my older tubs that are in my worm farm, this will be the destination for any migrated worms that come out of those bins. So I just want to make sure we're not going to run into some sort of an overpopulation situation in here, but I think we've got plenty of space for more worms to be placed in here. The worms that I'm seeing are kind of spread out and look pretty cozy, and it's because when I built this bin, the food that was placed in here as part of the original build was scattered all over the entire surface of the bin, and then everything was covered up with leaves. And then, like I usually do, once I get into the routine feedings, I try to focus them into a particular area so I can always get a sense of how things are progressing, make it easier for me to check in on how that last feeding that I had applied is coming along. And just to remind myself where that last feeding had occurred, my traditional marker for feedings is a used coffee filter. So I like to cover up with the used coffee filter as an indicator to show that this was where we fed last, just in case we start moving the feeding zone around as we do sometimes. So things look pretty nice in here. And for a 6-day-old bin, if you count the feeding that was part of the original build of the bin, this bin is now up to its 2nd feeding. Pretty cool. Gonna get this thing covered back up and return them to where they were so they can get back to work. Alright, now up next is the 42-day-old bin, 6 weeks old now. And even though there's about 5 weeks of age difference between these two containers, I like to try to pair them up so that when I'm coming down here to feed one, I could just take care of two at the same time. So I believe I'm going to start treating these two bins as kind of buddies, so that when I come down to tend to the needs of one, I can just simply tend to the needs of both. You can see that the top surface here has got some really beautiful castings spread over it. And before we set this cover aside, I'm just going to make sure we don't have any worms hanging out on it. So I'm just going to do a quick scrape off here before we set the plastic aside. Something new I'm trying here is to actually cover the cardboard, which serves as sort of a lid for my contents of my bin, with a sheet of thin plastic. That also helps with the retention of moisture to prevent evaporation. And at some point I might end up eliminating it if it starts to look like the contents of the bin become too damp. But in the beginning, when I know that I've got mostly bedding materials and maybe not so much moisture yet, I like to try to keep the recirculation of the moisture happening as opposed to letting it all evaporate out. And then later we could try to, strive towards making the contents of the bin a little bit drier. So I'm trying to remember what happened here last time we checked in. If memory serves me correctly, we had come across a number of pieces of cardboard like this and like this, and we had actually used that stuff to try to mark where we had last fed. We'll just use them as bedding within our feeding zone. Now here, you'll recognize it from its shape, I'm sure. We've added a whole banana. And usually whole bananas in worm bins are very, very popular places to be. So although I can feel kind of gooiness inside, it doesn't seem like the skin of the banana has really been infiltrated yet. It makes me wonder what it is that I'm feeling inside, whether it's worms or whether it's still just the banana itself. But you can see right below it, clearly a popular spot for the worms to congregate. And this is just another old food item, a mango pit. We'll just take whatever old food bits we locate here as we open up the feeding zone for the addition of today's installment of food. And see what we come across. So you can see all kinds of interesting little slow composting woody items. This is the stem of a pumpkin. These are all food items that most probably came over with some of the worms that were relocated from other places into this bin. And it's kind of a theme in a lot of my worm bins is that certain food items are clearly known to be slow composting items, and I don't get frustrated waiting for them to break down. I simply pop in on them on a regular basis to see how they're progressing. I mean, here you could see two mango seeds side by side, where one that hasn't quite been infiltrated so much looks like that, and this one, which I actually hacked the end off of, is coming along quite a bit nicer, possibly because of the ability for the worms to get at the shell of the seed from all sides. So here we've got kind of a theme coming together, right? That you could tell is the rind of a cantaloupe melon. So I think we'll just start opening up the space here in the middle to give us room to feed. Here too we had a good number of worms hanging out in that avocado shell. I believe this is just another chunk of the same. But it's so much fun when you encounter a spot where the red wigglers have come together to take advantage of some sort of a delicious food item. Because the red wigglers really do like to kind of pile on in order to consume their food. I've not found that to be the behavior in my night crawler bins. Somehow the night crawlers seem to be much more solitary, and they don't seem to jumble together the way these red wigglers do. It's part of the reason I like using the red wigglers, because there's always kind of an exciting feeding frenzy happening when you come in here to check on how they're doing. And naturally they're going to scatter from the bright lights because they don't like that, that's for sure. But before they do, we always get a little bit of a show. Especially in a heavily populated bin like this one with what's estimated to be something in the neighborhood of 5,000 worms. And you could see here I'm generating a pretty good sized pile of food items that I'm extracting from the feeding zone here. But I count a lot of these, all these mango seeds and that stem of the pumpkin and even these remaining shells of the avocado. I treat all those things as fairly slow composting items, which will take many, many weeks, possibly months in some cases, to fully break down. And that's the reason I like to come in here on a regular basis and give them other foods which are a little bit easier to break down and get consumed a little bit more quickly. So I'm just opening up a hole here that we can place their next feeding in. I guess the sooner the better, because that cabbage is beginning to thaw out. I bought it down here frozen, but as it starts to thaw out, it is starting to become a little bit stinky, the way rotten cabbage tends to do. So I don't think we'll be in here much longer sightseeing. I think what we're ready to do now is simply reset the feeding zone. Very similar to the way we just did in the other bin. Like I said, I'm going to be trying to keep these bins in tandem with one another. So I will try to use materials that are comparable to each other. In the case of this bin though, since I know that there's probably more than twice as many worms in it, I'll just go a little bit more generous on the portion I give them. Got all kinds of worms hanging out of my glove. Come on guys, get off. So whatever remains in that bag, I'm going to give them now. That's a pretty generous portion of food, that is for sure. See, it's not frozen anymore. The stuff is all thawing out. I got a feeling they're really going to enjoy this though. So to top things off, we'll just start moving some of these old food chunks back in. But oh, let's not forget, let's give them a little bit of this grit over here too. Especially in these newer bins, I like to be fairly generous on the grit. And over time, the grit in the bin probably gets to the point where it's not necessary to continue adding it. But it seems like in the beginning it makes good sense to include it with mostly all of the feedings. So back go the mango pits, back go the banana. Banana is really cool. I love the way that looks when we visit back in on it, and you can see all the worms piling up to get a piece of the juices flowing out of it. So we'll put that center stage so that the next time we come back in here, it's the first thing we see. I don't always remember what I did in the last feeding, so it's usually a surprise. I've got numerous bins that I'm maintaining on various cycles and on different days, and even though it's only been a week or so since these two bins last got fed, it's usually a little bit of a mystery of what to expect when I get in here, because I don't always remember what I had done previously. Sometimes I try to give myself a little bit of a refresher by watching the video from the previous week, and that helps me kind of get into the right frame of mind and set my expectations a little bit better. Yeah, but today I did not do that in preparation for today's feeding. I just came on down here with the cabbage to feed them and to get them all set up for another week or so of composting. Alright, I'm just trying to see if I could locate any other scraps of food that we pulled out, but there's certainly no harm in leaving stuff scattered about. That's just fine as well. So let's get this thing covered up with some leaves as well. So here too, I think we're just going to use leaves to cover up like we did before. Sprinkle them over the top. Be generous with the bedding. I'm sure they'll appreciate that. So these last couple of handfuls of bedding I've been spreading over the entire surface here, while at the same time I'm trying to level off. But that pretty much brings us to the conclusion of today's feeding for these two bins. So that was fun. It's always great to get into these heavily populated bins like this one to see how the worms are doing and to give them a little bit more food and see what they've done with the previous feeding. It's always kind of cool to check in. So there's not much left for me to do here. I just got a little bit of cleaning up to do and a few things to put away, but that's boring. I'm not going to take up your time with that. Before I turn off the camera, let me just say thank you. Thanks for keeping me company. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, then, please put them in the comments section below. I usually do my best to respond to everyone's questions and comments. And also, there's that subscribe button down there. If you haven't hit it yet, then be sure to become a subscriber. I always appreciate getting new people on board as subscribers. And last but not least, please give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.